philosophy from Salaam University, and as respondent Justin Sands. Dr. Justin Sands is doing his second PhD. He's from Augustine College. Justin, well, that's a Freudian slip, isn't it? So the talk will take about, the title is reading Helen reading Wiredu reading Quine, and it will take about 35 minutes. After that, the response will take about 10 minutes, and there will be plenty of time for discussion, about 15 minutes. So keep your questions succinct. You can either write them in the chat box or else unmute and speak up by the end of the response. If you don't mind to switch off your videos and also your mics, then we are ready to go. Helen, over to you.
Okay, first of all, let me thank you so deeply for the invitation and challenge to share with you. I think to make sure I don't run out of time, I'll start in the middle of the introduction, which is to say, in this most recent book, is published in 2021, Barry Hallen interconnects the entire breadth of Wiredu's concerns. Now, if you want to know who Barry Hallen is, I can talk about that later, maybe in the Q&A. This is no easy task in itself, just to gather and mention accurately all of Wiredu's disparate and overlapping works published all over the world. Many of the best have been revised, reissued, reprinted under different titles, and later compiled into important volumes, most notably Philosophy and an African Culture in 1980 and Cultural Universals and Particulars, an African Perspective in 1996. Hallen's new book is well designed in that it has 6 main chapters introduced and concluded with remarks that place each theme in Wiredu's repertoire: his concern with metaphysics, his philosophical methodology, his philosophy of language, his moral and political theory in relation to all the others. And this linking is accomplished with a minimum of repetition. The book is also very scholar-friendly, or intends to be. It's meticulous in presenting Wiredu's various essays in all their variety and detail and paging throughout the text. These are cited not just by book, but by chapters in books, and you get the full progeny in the bibliography. In this light, the book will be requisite in helping future students and scholars to formulate research proposals in all directions. Yet this book has 3 separate bibliographies. One is called bibliography. The second is called supplementary Wiredu bibliography. And the third is commentaries and relevant texts. So I'm doing a book review, so I'm just pleading for, right now, a reissue where we get a consolidation of the information in the bibliographies. And now I should get on with the trouble that I got from the outset in the book, was that Hallen treats Quine's claims about logic and language from an adversarial standpoint in order to illuminate the significance of Quine's work from chapter 1 through chapter 4. And there's every good reason that he did so. I hold very little doubt that Wiredu had a over-the-shoulder look into the book as it was being produced. And we can't ask, however, because the great tree fell in 2022, a year after the book was published. I imagine Wiredu wanted to be totally transparent to his readers, so he allowed everything to come in all its glory and with all the pimples. That's what I'm suspecting. Because, for instance, in his first 4 papers, he challenges Quine. He virtually ridicules Quine. But then in his later work, his more mature productions, he doesn't mention Quine at all, or when he does, it's quite approvingly and with great elegance and respect. So before I start whinging, let me first refer to points that are relevant to chapters 5 and 6, And that's where we get the gist of Wiredu's moral theory and how he informs his morality through his social and political reflections on democracy. Hallen describes Wiredu's principle of sympathetic impartiality. And then he shows how Wiredu argues for an alternative called consensual democracy, which is to offset the negative impacts of multi-party politics and adversarial politics that dominate oligarchic democracies, the UK, the USA. And he's pointing out that indigenous African morals can inform us through consensus, a type of government which would actually support and enhance the need for sustainable development, economic development. And then I think the point I want to raise at this stage is that the book itself is really important to have on hand because Hallen is very diligent in providing details about how to get in touch with Wiredu's works, and it's very difficult to do that. And I think that most of the discrepancy and misinterpretation of Wiredu's views, right down to the very widely publicized debates with him, are not due to his writing, but due to the obscurity in sourcing many of his publications. So I make mention of Eze's conflict with Wiredu over democracy and one-party rule and no-party rule. And if you want to, we can come back to that. I think it's important to notice about Wiredu that there's a general shortfall in African studies of philosophy. That is, there's a failure to recognize Wiredu's seminal contribution to many concerns that have been discussed since he was publishing. And sometimes his work gets attributed to a Ghanaian philosopher, but not him. And it might be that Wiredu's lifetime of gentlemanly, poised renunciation of the limelight is an example of what he calls the principle of sympathetic impartiality, whereby in his own application, he just allows his agenda to be carried out, independent of what it means for him personally. And I know that in his life. For instance, I was at the University of Ghana, where he was one of the first members of the faculty. After he left Oxford, he started teaching there for almost 10 years. And his book, Philosophy and an African Culture, is nowhere to be seen. I never heard of Wiredu, and yet I was teaching from 1988. And then in 1994, when I was back at Oxford, looking at the stacks, the open stacks for philosophy of mathematics under Wittgenstein, there was this book by Wiredu, Philosophy and an African Culture. I'd never heard of him before. I was absolutely shocked that we didn't carry this book in the very well-known, widely recognized Baum Library, which is well endowed with books. So what is going on there? I think it would be worth, just as a matter of sociology or gossip, to find out how it is that Wiredu's magnificence is so little known on the African continent. It could be argued that this lack of awareness of Wiredu's works is the reason why he's so overlooked. Well, I've just said a circularity there. Let me get back to my troubles from the beginning in this book, where Hallen's reading of Wiredu results in a representative of high caliber philosophy, someone who was trained by P.F. Strawson, by Gilbert Ryle, by Stuart Hampshire, who was surely influenced by Michael Dummett. These are the people that Quine grew up in, in philosophy as a PhD student at Oxford. So why would it be that somebody of that caliber rejects Quine's proposal, for instance, that ontological commitments are best determined through logical regimentation of scientific theories? Quine's famous claim is that ordinary language will not help us understand what exists. Ordinary language leads us into paradoxes and misunderstandings that are legendary. Is existence a predicate? There's a huge literature on this. And what Quine proposes is that we rely on logical notation to decipher what the best scientific theories of our day teach us about how the world is. And from those sentences, we can discern what must exist in order for them to be true. And that's how we can arrive in an ontology. That's not the end of the story, but it is the beginning. Wiredu is depicted by Hallen right from the beginning as explicitly rejecting Quine's suggestion that logical regimentation is going to teach us anything about the way the world actually is. Now, I think the reason that Hallen does that is because he's being deferential to people that don't know quantificational logic. And I think that's a mistake. I think we need to teach our students quantificational logic. And since I believe that, I have to produce a book in Swahili and English, which provides that opportunity to East African students. I think we're leaving our students without any resistance to the word escapes me, soothsayers and people who are waving their hands and throwing tarot cards to show how different and exceptional African logics are in comparison with what comes out in the world through hegemonic English. And I'm not sure that's the best way for our students to move forward in African philosophy. But in any case, let's get back to the contrast between Hallen as he reads Wiredu and Quine's views. There is a tension apparent tension between Quine, who is a scientific realist about truth and about what there is. In other words, rely on the best science, and that's going to teach you how to understand the structure of reality. And that seems to contrast with Wiredu's view that truth is opinion. I can't demonstrate that that's not a good contradiction to draw. I don't think they're in conflict. But I think it is useful to notice that one of the tensions in Quine's scientific realism and in his views about the way language produces truth, those are indissoluble. They're not separable. They're inseparable. The connection between understanding a statement and understanding the way the world is. You can't separate those two dimensions of belief. There's no analytic synthetic distinction in Quine's understanding of knowledge. So neither can you reduce knowledge to a series of individual sentences. You must take all the sentences that we take to be true as a whole. You must take all the beliefs we accept as a whole. And therefore, he is not going to appreciate someone's looking at language as the source of ontology. Rather, it's how we use language to describe our scientific results that give us, in any sense at all, a purchase on deciding an ontology. It doesn't give us an ontology, but it gives us a criterion for choosing between ontologies. That's what science should do for us. However, there is a conflict here between scientific's realism and his expectations of language as a blunt instrument for designating the way the world is. So let's consider this, for example, if we had two theories, theory 1 and theory 2, and they're both supported equally by all the available evidence, all the stimulations that any scientist can experience will lead them to either theory 1 or theory 2. There's no way to discriminate between them. They're both supported equally. Then there's nothing to recommend one of these theories over the other. And so then there would be no way to decide which theory is true, and therefore there's no way to decide which theory we should rely on to determine our ontology. Now, if that's the case, then what sustains the rivalry, the purported rivalry between theory 1 and theory 2? Well, presumably it's the theoretical terms. One refers to witches or neutrinos, and the other one says, no, there's no neutrinos. There's really just the God molecule, the Gibbs boson, and strings. So which is correct? You go with the one that you think is more elegant, say, and the one that whose theoretical terms provide the most meaning. However, theoretical terms don't have meanings as far as Quine is concerned, except as they might inspire a listener to assent or to dissent given the available stimuli. And so for these two theories, there's no differentiation at the level of experience to go by. How should we then proceed to rely upon scientific results in order to determine truths about reality, or indeed an ontology? On Quine's picture, what counts as ontological truth boils down to highfalutin opinion. What do the people wearing tuxedos with a lot of research money believe to be true? And so you are stuck with truth as opinion, which is exactly what Wiredu would like us to recognize. So both of them are in alignment on issues that then yield a conflict between being empirically driven in one's understanding of human nature and the way the world is and how communication works, and truth, relying on empirical evidence, and also conceding to the limitation of empirical evidence. In other words, neither of them are behaviorists. There's much more that meets the eye and the mind than what you see and feel around you. No one would argue with that, and I'll give you an example of that. Quine certainly is no a reductionist in the sense of he doesn't believe that the world, he's not a physicalist, let's put it that way, in the sense that everything boils down to phenomena, or everything boils down to well, for instance, in mathematics, he's not a strict constructionist. He doesn't suggest that mathematics is just a bunch of elaborately controlled symbols. He would concede that the number 1, the number 2, the number 3 stand for something. Maybe they stand for sets, but what is a set? And he will say that looking at the terms 1, 2, and 3, looking at the principles by which we are taught to use these, the way they're defined, we cannot determine which of two competing definitions of set is the true one. The ontology we choose always reflects back on our whole system of beliefs, which in turn is determined by the way we navigate the world as physical creatures, dealing with sensory stimuli as best we can, collectively. So our communication matters. And that's exactly what Wiredu would agree to. So in fundamental ways, there's a confluence, a convergence of Wiredu's preoccupations and Quine's commitments. Another tension that underlies Quine is, again, in his naturalism. But when it's led to an extreme, it results in a conflicting with itself. So here's the way that happens. In principle, for absolute consistency, Quine seems ready to renounce even the law of non-contradiction. It's never the case that P can both be true and false. That's absolutely out of the question. And that, for some, would be a rock solid bottom law that we must necessarily rely upon in order to survive. But Quine says, no, we could go with intuitionists in rejecting that. It would, the rejection of the law of non-contradiction should be our appropriate response to stimuli. If we're pushed by stimuli, we should reject even the law of non-contradiction. For example, if there's sufficient data in particle field theory physics that electron at time t is moving with velocity v, and it's also not the case that that electron at that time is moving with velocity v. Indeed, because introducing your observation of the electron will introduce energy and affect its velocity or its location or its speed. So what Quine is saying is that we have to be free and ready to give up even the law of non-contradiction. And Wiredu would say, well, that's ridiculous. But the thing is, Quine also seems to think it's ridiculous because he subscribes in his mathematics to classical laws of logic, where the non-contradiction is required. The law is required in order to establish the existence, for instance, of irrational numbers, or even the simpler proof that you can never divide by zero. That requires the law of non-contradiction to get going. So even simple mathematics, simple arithmetic requires us to accept this law, regardless of how we might think about contrary to fact conditionals in an alternative world, which of course can't exist for Quine. Here we are. And then again, what about our biochemical propensity to get across the street safely? The reason this matters for Wiredu is this. Quine's naturalized epistemology, reducing everything to genetic biodeterminism, this closely aligns with Wiredu's way of understanding human behavior, human communication, human understanding of what is true, that is knowledge. You see that there's a close alliance here. And the reason I raise this, the reason I even think about this is because Hallen's paper suggests it's not the case. And So I'm befuddled at these crucial points about the purported opposition between Quine and Wiredu. And I'm not in any position to clarify these matters. I don't have any answers to the riddle either about how Quine should resolve the tension in his empirically equivalent systems of the world. I only suggest these would be fruitful avenues of convergence to explore. And there's tremendous heuristic value in this book, even if you think that they've got it wrong completely about Quine. It's in chapter 2 that we're introduced to ways we might avoid reifying Western hegemony in African philosophy. And of course, this is really what bothered Wiredu in his day. And his genetic method, which I just described, he in his understanding of the method of relying on genetic pressures on the human as a creature, this he derived from John Dewey, and yet Quine's idea is also derived from John Dewey. So I want to say again that the influence of American pragmatism, and indeed even the late Wittgenstein, the way he depicts language as the way people communicate with each other and not embedded in semantics and syntax, I think these are fruitful foundations on which to compare rather than diametrically oppose the themes that matter to Wiredu and Quine, contrary to what you learn in the book. So there are some specific ways that I think Quine is presented through Hallen with reading of Wiredu, which are just wrong. And this means, when I say they're wrong, they confront me with assumptions about Quine that I've just held on to for 50 years and never thought I needed to really justify. So if a book in philosophy is not worth reading unless it creates in oneself the desire to explore new territory, which I get from chapter 6 on consensus. And it also throws me back to be distressed over having to defend views that I've taken for granted for so long. Then this is a very good book. Very good book. Even though I disagree with most of what he says, it's valuable in these ways. One point I do not understand comes very early when he assigns to Quine the idea that names, which feature nouns, feature so prominently in English, and that's why Quine prefers the referential or objectual interpretation of the value of a variable. I think that this is a mistake entirely. I find this alarming. There's much to say here about the reasons why Quine avoids names, but it's sufficient to just show that his refusal to accept any particular ontology on universal grounds is enough for Wiredu to fight the hegemony of Anglophonic philosophy. Because just because someone says it in English doesn't mean it's necessarily true. I know that sounds crude, but it wasn't crude to champion against that when Wiredu was at Oxford. And in those days, Africans had nothing to say except to anthropologists to describe how they make their grass skirts. I mean, we've moved quite a ways, but it's been very few decades. So Quine jumps to avoid relying on names. That's why he wants to regiment scientific theories using quantificational logic. That means the scope of a quantified variable, what it ranges over, will help us understand what makes a statement true and what the world must be like in order for that statement, not in isolation, but as a part of a whole theory, which best explains our experience. And this is what really a lot of what Wiredu is concerned over may be traced back to Carnap, Rudolf Carnap's idea that he can create a ideal language for science. And of course, Quine followed right in step, except that very basic principles of how to create such a language, which of course failed ultimately, but Carnap believed you can stipulate the appropriate vocabulary for the best scientific framework of your data. You stipulate what terms will be cognitively meaningful. That could be an electron or it could be a witch, depending on how you will provide the best scientific theory overall. So you can determine the meanings of words, and that will help you build an ideal language for a science. And it's also sentence by sentence that you can determine what there is. If this sentence by itself has meaning, that is, it's verifiable, then it will help us determine how the world is. And the famous critique of Quine, labeled Two Dogmas of Empiricism, challenges directly Carnap's idea that some of our beliefs, some of our decision-making is based on how we want to use language, and other beliefs we hold are about the way the world is. So we can construct the former in order to accommodate the latter. And Quine thinks that analytic synthetic bifurcation is a total mythology, and he divorces himself from Carnap. He also refuses to accept that a statement can be reduced to sense experience or behavior in order to determine its value as true or false. So we have to understand holistically how we communicate with each other, how we understand each other in order to arrive at a theory of truth. And that's exactly what Wiredu is saying when he demands that the genetic methodology dominate. Now, as for that picture of two different ways of looking at sets, let me just move forward to accommodate your kind treatment of my little diagram there. I'm trying to show, though, through that diagram that these represent, you don't even have to describe them. You can just look at them. What is 1 + 2 = 3? That is certainly true. It's not an issue about translating it into Kiswahili. Moja na mbili sawa na tatu. And that's a word for word, no problem there. You could do it with Zulu, you could do it with Yoruba, Igbo, all of the languages, you can say this. So when we talk about the indeterminacy of translating that, we're not talking about interlinguistic translations. That's not what the indeterminacy of translation is about. One thing it's about is how should we understand what the term one means? What does the term 2 mean? What does the term 3 mean? And of course, for hundreds of years, people have been working on set theory to explain what a number is. But there's two ways of understanding how we arrive at counting numbers, how these are names for sets. So on the left-hand side, you could think of 0 as the nothing, no set at all exists, and that's what 0 stands for. Then 1 could be the set containing one member, that is the null. The existence of nothing is the element of the set 1. Then 2, on the left side we're looking at, contains 0 and 1 as elements. 3 contains 0 and 1 and 2 as elements. And on, indefinitely. Another way you could think about sets is to say, as Frege did and as Russell did, that, okay, nothing is zero. Zero stands for nothing. One stands for all the sets that are, whose members can be put in one-to-one correspondence with nothing. And that's the set that one represents. Two represents the set of all sets that can be put in one-to-one relation with the set of one. And three then is the set of all sets that comprise two, which, by the way, you'll remember, is comprised of one, and so on. My terminology is clumsy. It doesn't matter what I say. You can just see visually this difference in ways of construing sets. I think it's plain to the eye that there's a difference here. And the whole point that Quine is making in the inscrutability of reference is there's nothing independent of your beliefs and convictions and values about sets, how to manipulate them, what you mean by parsimony, what are you trying to do with your set theory, what problems do you want to avoid, what paradoxes are you attempting to evade, what's a concept that you're concerned with. These determine your choice of which of these alternatives is the ontology that you adapt to. And there you have your ontology relativized. And it's due to the fact that the reference, the word itself, cannot designate anything independently of some background of beliefs, which Wiredu would completely accept. I have to stop because it's 37 minutes. I'm sorry, I should have read, but I got scared.
Thank you very much, Helen. It's the third time I'm going through this. This is illuminating every time. Okay, it's over to you, Justin.
Okay, thank you, everybody, and thank you, Prof. Lauer, for your illuminating presentation. I am not by any means a Quine scholar. I engage deeply with Wiredu's work. So my approach to this response is more of a yes and to Prof. Lauer's reading and critique of Quine, and to look at the book largely as it is. Before I begin, though, I'd like to thank Professor Abraham Olivier at the University of Hare and the Center of Leadership and Ethics in Africa for this wonderful opportunity. Also, thank you again, Professor Lauer, for your excellent paper. I'm honored to be able to respond to it. I'll begin with just appropriating Jeremiah Erosoegbe's question: what differences exist between a university in Africa and an African university? I'm likewise compelled to ask, is Hallen's book about a philosopher from Africa or an African philosopher? I ask this because the book's structure and content seem to be aimed more at Wiredu's earlier engagements with the Oxbridge analytic tradition than they are about Wiredu's advocating for and achievements within African philosophy. To be fair and sure, Hallen does bring in the latter into account, but as Professor Lauer has noted, it is often as a refutation of Quine, amongst others, and comprises the initial 4 chapters. It is not until the final 2 chapters where Hallen touches upon what I would call Wiredu's standalone African philosophy. I'm left wondering that if I were to use this book as an introduction to Wiredu's work, which might be the aim of the work, and we will query this further later, what would my students take from it? If I can put myself in my students' shoes, I believe that they would leave thinking that Wiredu was a very influential analytic philosopher who employed his own African background, which is a monumental achievement during this time, as Prof. Lauer has noted, to progress the analytic tradition. I'm uncertain if they would feel the heft and monumental shift Wiredu's work had here on the African soil. I doubt that they would recognize how his work transgressed the ethno and professional philosophy debates to arrive at a moral anthropology, which has vastly changed African philosophy's trajectory of moving it toward discovering new epistemic frameworks and reappreciating its own heritage as a wellspring of philosophical thinking. Perhaps this is too much of my own background, though, and I need to be wary of that. In short, I was introduced to Wiredu through his article, How Not to Compare African Traditional Thought with Western Thought, and of course, cultural universals in particulars. So to me, I began engaging Wiredu within a decolonial and African philosophical context, which only touched upon analytic thought when it needed to clarify or defend an argument. Consequently, I found Hallen's focus on Wiredu's earlier career achievements very helpful and enlightened me to some blind spots in my appreciation of Wiredu, the key one being Dewey's genetic method and its influence on Wiredu's entire oeuvre. Yet I'm uncertain as to why Hallen's book is mostly an engagement with Quine and Wiredu, along with Dewey here and there. Yet still, I sympathize with Hallen, given that my first PhD dissertation and its eventual book covered one entire thinker's career. Mine was a philosopher of religion, Merrill Westphal, whose career had a three-act structure, if you will. First, he was a co-founder and eventual president of the Hegelian Society of America. Then he shifted to Kierkegaard and eventually becoming the president of the Kierkegaard Society of America. And finally, he began deeply engaging postmodernity and philosophy of religion. So where does one begin to break down this and not go over 500 pages? And although Hallen's agile knowledge and academic footprint is massively larger than my own, I'm not trying to compare myself with them, I can feel the same concern emanating through Hallen's introduction and his book structure. What to cover, why, and how. So I get that he was tasked with a behemoth of a project, and we all know that Hallen is the best person to do it. If anyone knows Wiredu's works best, it's Barry Hallen. This is consequently why I'm slightly struck by the fact that the book did not focus more on Wiredu's African philosophy, save for the quick 2 chapters on his African moral theory and his notion of consensual democracy. Even there, I wonder, who is Hallen's audience? Is he writing to analytic philosophers who need to remember and engage Wiredu? Or is it to students who need an introduction to Wiredu? Is it mostly a white European audience? Or is it a mostly subaltern African one? Hallen knows that this is a very difficult question when covering such towering figures like Wiredu. And I remember his strident critique against Sonia Osha's book, Quasi-Wiredu and Beyond, The Text, Writing, and Thought in Africa. At the risk of oversimplification, Hallen rebuffs Osha's positioning of Wiredu, stating that, and I'm quoting here, I, Barry Hallen, am not sure that Wiredu has ever explicitly identified himself as an analytic philosopher, which Osha assumes he is. Certainly throughout his career, Wiredu has consistently repudiated the attempt to link his approach to philosophy in the African context with logical positivism. But this is an indictment that Osha resurrects, end quote. He then goes on to defend Wiredu's conceptual decolonization, a notion which Osha claims does little, if anything, to propel or inform the decolonization movement. Hallen's approach in this, by the way, is very, very good. And he points out that maybe Osha is not reading Wiredu correctly. This is Hallen at his best, if you ask me. He comes with clear, direct points which reveal how Wiredu's thought operates within African philosophy on its own terms. That is neither an ethno nor professional philosophy. And even though some African thinkers like Yeke and Eze may disagree with Wiredu, they cannot deny the importance of his work. I beg her to ask, though, where is this Wiredu within reading Wiredu? There are traces, to be sure, but just enough to give thinkers like Osha to proclaim, I told you so, rather than I might have been wrong. Although Wiredu acolytes such as myself may find illuminating points within this book, I worry whether those engaging him for the first time, or even his detractors, will see Wiredu within the book here as just a philosopher from Africa and not an African philosopher. That's my response. And with that, I have a few questions, but I can save those for later if you'd like.
Helen, would you like to respond directly?
Well, yes. I mean, I want to respond with a question. Would you allow me to publish that as the review of this book that will appear in a Brill journal? I think you're familiar with Utafiti, Journal of African Perspectives. Could we please run your review? I mean, essentially, I think it's the right length. You have many more important things to say from the African philosophical perspective. Please, can we publish it? That's wonderful.
Shoot an email to me. I'm happy to do so.
Great. I'll shoot the email, and we need it right away. But you've already polished this. That's fantastic. Yeah. I should be quiet. Let other people talk.
Well, that's a high compliment, so I deeply appreciate it.
Congratulations,
sincere.
there, Justin.
It's just in genuine eagerness. I mean, it's what we call acquisitive. I mean, it's a very good review. So I would love to have that published. Thank you. Yeah.
Good. Very well. Thank you so much. This is pragmatism at its best. Any questions from the audience? Just unmute and speak up if I don't see your hand going up. Chris, please come in. Chris Ozerbrook. You have to unmute, Chris.
Thank you very much for that. Thanks. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Let me try again. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I can hear you.
There you are.
Thanks. That was great. I've not read the book, but it makes me want to read the book. The talk. Thank you very much, Helen. And thanks for covering so thoroughly the Quine, who I don't know well enough. So I just noticed though, and also sorry, thanks, Justin. I think that's a plausible criticism, but I just wondered, Helen, you show quite often where Quine and Wiredu converge, but it seems you were gesturing that there's some tension there, and I didn't quite understand what the tension is. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about where they're disagreeing, Quine and Wiredu?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I should have been reading, but I wrote too long a presentation, so I was trying to get through it by being ad lib, which is a mistake. I should know better. Empirically equivalent systems of the world. Look, the tension I was talking about is within Quine. It's between, for instance, his scientific realism, on the one hand, that theories will determine if we regiment them properly and interpret the regimentation correctly, that will yield a bona fide or at least a plausible ontology for us. We should derive our understanding of the real world beyond experience through what we gain from experience, well disciplined. Okay, so that's scientific realism. He's a realist about truth in that sense. However, he also demands us appreciate the inscrutability of the referential terms in every sentence. Inscrutability meaning you can't tell from a word what its referent is exactly. There are alternatives. Are you with me? Alternative meanings. So when you're out in the field with a native and you point at that moving object in the field and you say Gavagai and she assents, what is that assent signal? Does it mean we're talking about lunch later? Moving over there, there's lunch. Or do we mean rabbit part? You remember the famous case, or rabbit slice? Are we together? Are you with me? The time frame. Okay, so that's the sense in which you can't tell from the role that a word is playing in language, what beyond language it's going to teach us. And you can't do that sentence by sentence. You have to rely on the whole of your belief system. Are we together? So where's the tension?
Yeah, so that's,
well, here we go. So,
okay,
so that's Quine, right? Okay, so here we go. Theory 1 and theory 2 are empirically equivalent. So we're relying on 1975 in Erkenntnis, volume 9. And that's where he describes empirically equivalent systems, and all the available experience that anybody could have will reflect or defend T1 as well as T2, right? It's just like it's the same as if you had two linguists producing manuals of how to translate the native. And there's no way, independent of their own perspectives and values, to determine which of these translations is correct. That's the indeterminacy of translation. Are we together? Yes? And when it comes not to everything that she does and says, all the noises she makes and movements she makes, but when you're looking at just particular terms, then it's that the reference of a term is inscrutable. You can't tell what it is in the world unless you're relying on everything you learn from scientists. Then we know to say, okay, quarks exist. But there's no theory independent way of determining whether a quark exists or not. Fair, right? Where scientific realism is. So now what if you have two competing theories, T1 and T2? And the experience you could, well, maybe ever have, that's questionable, but supposing all possible experience will not determine which is the one you want to accept, then for Quine, it boils down that the two theories are saying the same thing, which is a problem because they were supposed to be able to distinguish for us what our ontology is supposed to be, what reality.
It seems to cause a
Chris,
lot of
it seems
problems.
you
with
want to come back.
realism.
Yes.
Does Wiredu follow up on that and then just bite the bullet and drop the scientific realism?
Yeah, and then Wiredu would also have to drop his genetic methodology, which is the most important thing to him. They both are generating from Dewey and James and Paris, right? We run by what's true as Americans. We run by what's true, according to what works, what keeps us alive. There's no more to it than that. Take away all the frills, which enrages Russell. And Quine couldn't.
And that must influence Wiredu's use of African concepts to talk about philosophy, because since our terms influence our ontology.
Yeah, but he doesn't want to be restricted to what scientists tell us. He wants to look, because he's interested in advocating the indigenous elders, the indigenous knowledge bearers of his own community. So you have to look at oral literature, you have to look at epitaphs, you have to look at proverbs, you have to look at the way the wise men of his village express themselves and keep everybody alive and heal people and resolve disputes within the community. They make everything work. And they do so with the use they make of languages, which is not regimentizable. Why should it be? You know, it's too Quine's domain of who's legitimate as far as providing a use of noise and noise, especially because it's all orally conveyed. Which communication counts shouldn't be restricted to white people in lab coats, to put a point on it. Now, I think, there's a little bit of sociology around this that I'd love to share, but it's I guess it's tacky.
It's thank you very much, Helen. Anybody else? Perhaps while waiting, we argued this morning about meaning. Quine rejects the notion of meaning. I was just wondering, I understand no word has a specific meaning. That means a meaning with a particular reference. It's inscrutable, as you say. But if meaning is produced in terms of a whole set of words or sentences in a holistic context, can Quine really then escape the notion of meaning? It looks like meaning is produced actually genetically almost, and this is where the two might meet. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more, even after the discussion this morning, about the term meaning. Can we really dispense of it? How would we imagine Quine to respond, really? Is this not the meeting point between them?
Well, I don't think so. I think that for Quine, he would accept meaning when it's synonymous with understanding. When you talk about understanding or people appreciating each other's intentions, reading each other, you know. But so this is very Wittgensteinian, isn't it? I think. I mean, I can tell what you mean, not by the sound that you make, obviously, and not by your pointing plus the sound you make. I could think you're showing me your finger, and that's what I mean by moon, right? The point is that meaning is nothing independent of the communication activities of the speakers, the linguistic community. Okay, let's say, I want to use an analogy. Let's say we need shelter, so we build a house together, right? And so what does the house mean? The existence of the house is fulfilled because it's keeping us dry and warm and safe. And that's what a home is. There's nothing over and above the not just the structure itself, of course, but the use to which we put it. Here, the Dewey, right? The use to which we put it, the reasoning we have behind creating it. Are we together? So, but you don't want to say there's another thing beyond that, lingering ephemerally, which is what we mean by home. Am I making sense? So it's
Yes.
all in the interactions. That's what meaning is, and nothing else other than that.
Right. So my question would be: don't be necessarily assume some established meanings. For instance, houses, places we can go in, a place where Quine can go in to do science, for instance. So are these meanings not around? I mean, also Wiredu would say meaning really consists in the use of the signifier. So he agrees with that. And he doesn't believe in universal meanings floating around. That's Plato, right? But he does think that there are some meanings which are
that's
kind
the
of
realism,
presumed,
yes.
isn't it? There's
Yes,
some assumptions we all
some,
use.
well, this is it. The way you tell what there is by looking at a scientific theory that solves a problem for you or explains something, regiment the sentences in it, and decide what needs to exist in order for those sentences compositely to be true. And that's what there is. And meaning doesn't have to enter into that. Quarks do, right? Pain does, say. Just for the hell of it, right? But
right. I'll stop here.
Okay.
But this is beautiful. I would like to go on, but Justin, you have a question. That's the only hand I can see.
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah.
I just wanted to add on to it. First, a personal anecdote, and then I'll get to a little bit of the point. Whenever I first started exploring philosophy on a postgraduate level, I thought that these terms, these deep philosophical concepts like Aufhebung, was just like a special terminology, if you will. And it wasn't until later that I found out that it was just everyday German. That people use that word or use these terms in everyday normal language. If you're in Germany, you may use the word. I always thought of it as like this deep philosophical term that Hegel came up with and that employed and so forth, and etc. So I think that this is a good example of how like a word can convey two different meanings. And whenever I found out that it was just a normal word, not a actual like technical term per se, it was turned into one. That like was a Damascus moment where like the scales fell off my eyes. But I think that a good example of this also of what you're talking about and how he somewhat abandons the conversation to move on to another one is in cultural universals in particulars. Whenever he's critiquing the Christian missionaries and the way in which they tried to directly translate the word God and also with Jesus. And I think if I remember correctly off the top of my head, the way in which they translated it was like, at least for the Akan, was like the humpback man or the overarched man instead of God. And it also reminds me of Barbara Kingsolver's The Poisonwood Bible, where they mistranslated and say, Tata, Jesus is Bangala. Jesus is poisonwood. Jesus is going to kill you, and so it scared all the people they were trying to missionize to. And I think that Wiredu touches upon these moments to speak about the way in which communication is universal, but what is being communicated or the need to communicate becomes universal, but what is conveyed through that communication becomes culturally mediated, and that's where the particulars. And so as one becomes a person, as I became an American person, if you will, I was inculcated with English, its meanings, its subtext, its concept of irony, what sarcasm is, and so forth. But I had to learn that, and it comes through enculturation. So I think that Wiredu basically flips the question of positivism on its head by exploring the universal need to communicate, but then also how cultural cultural in general endows communication with certain meanings beyond reference and beyond the signifier. That was just my own little the conversation.
Yeah.
Would you like to comment, Helen?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm afraid Quine would be evasive. I'm trying to imagine how he would react to what you just said, which is really important, and I think you capture what concerns Wiredu. And I think Quine would dodge it. He would say, I think he would treat that as obvious, which is to dismiss it, which is crap, essentially. I mean, it's elitist, I think,
Yeah, I
and
agree
so
with that.
I'm sorry, yeah.
Yeah, no, this is actually, we're saying the same thing. I was just wondering if, yes, if implicitly Quine can go without it, if you abstract, I mean, the things, and if you infer he's using in logic, which Wiredu refers to at the end, is perhaps not in his own terms able to avoid a kind of meaning. So it's not just formal logic where the sentence, the propositions are combined. If P then Q, P therefore Q. It's not simply that it is without meaning in our everyday use in a culture. So maybe he's just a logician at the end, but he also wants to be the pragmatist, and I think there it's impossible to avoid meanings. It's 2:00. It's 2:02.
Let Justin talk, though. Can you?
Let Justin talk. Let's just see if there's anybody else to Justin, if you don't mind.
Okay, well,
No, okay.
In closing, really quickly, first off, if you're going to buy the book and you can afford it, I definitely recommend the Kindle version. It's absolutely wonderful. It has page numbers. You click on the footnotes, they pop up. The Kindle version, I think, is just fantastic. So if you're going to buy the book and you can afford it, then that'd be the best way to go about it. I just want to say it before we left. But anyways, going back to the conversation, I think this is the beauty of Wiredu that Hallen touches upon but slightly misses. And I would say, like, Wiredu gently despoils Quine and Dewey. Like, he takes from them and without outright rejecting them. And he reformulates these concepts to a certain degree. So whenever he is exploring translation, whenever he's exploring what is impartial versus what is partial, talking about like cultural universals, these are concepts which you can find or you can trace back to the Oxbridge analytic tradition, but they're by no means in that way. And this is the reason why I think that's important to go back to the title of one of the books that you wrote, that you contributed to, Prof. Lauer, The Third Way in African Philosophy, is that's what he's really doing. Now in this, in the sense of the book, he's discussing him as a third way between ethno and professional philosophy. But one could also argue, I would say, that he's the third way between, let's say, analytic and continental. And it's not necessarily an African philosophy proper per se. I mean, like, one could call it that, of course, but it's taking what is available to him, the philosophical training that he has, and then it's a translation or an application of it and reverting some of its logic and proving the hegemony of its logic. And then comes in the conceptual decolonization. So one needs to conceptually break apart these ideas and then look at where they come from. This is the Dewey method. Look at tracing them back, or a genealogy if you want to go continental, and then seeing how they not translate, but can be employed in order to understand, articulate your own understanding and your community's own understanding. And I think that that's a genius in Wiredu's work. And I think that Hallen, he touches upon how Wiredu gets there, but I don't think that he necessarily emphasizes it enough. And this is the reason why I had my question at the end.
Yeah. I I'm really appreciating your comment. I didn't know what the title of that anthology meant.
That's just my assumption.
Yeah, yeah. I'm referring to the third way,
Yeah,
which is essays in honor of Kwesi
Wiredu,
Wiredu, which I
of
was.
it, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So really, what you're talking about, the philosophical activism that drives Wiredu's work. And I think you're right that it's not prominent enough in the book that I just read. Apart from the fact that I got distracted by outright mistakes about Quine, but so who cares? I mean, I care because I was shocked to somebody I respect so much making such. But you know, this stuff of Quine has gone through a couple decades, you know, since he was even alive to correct people. So, and he lost favor completely in Oxford. I mean, Tim Williamson has no time for Quine at all. They just, as ever, thought he was just, you know, as you put it, in a rabbit hole. Speaking of Gaffagai, but so really, thank you for your review, which we will publish right away. Yeah. And well, Abraham, thank you. Where's Rihanna? Thank you so much for holding my hand for all this time.
I guess we are coming to an end here. So it's time to thank you both. Helen, this was excellent. I think the presentation went pretty well. It made clear what was in your paper, really. And Justin, for your excellent response and the very good discussion. Thanks for the questions. Thanks, everyone. This has worked. Load shedding didn't let us down.
Yeah, Murphy be damned, as you said.
Murphy's
you were right. Murphy's embarrassed, sitting in a corner.
Yes. We must stop now before he stops